She opened her hardware store that Saturday morning with no idea the customer walking in would turn her into something unimaginable. Hours later, Bernice Worden hung in a shed, her head in a burlap sack and her heart in a bag by the stove. But when police searched the killer's farmhouse, they found something worse. Chairs upholstered in human skin, bowls made from skulls, and a full-body suit crafted from flayed corpses. Bernice Worden wasn't his first victim. She was just his freshest. And the killer? A man the town trusted with their children. This is how a mother's boy became the monster that inspired Psycho, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Silence of the Lambs. Thanks for clicking on this video, and please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to stay updated with our new videos. Also, drop a comment sharing where you're watching from. Let's see which country has the most viewers. The farmhouse sat 6 miles outside Plainfield, Wisconsin, surrounded by nothing but empty fields and silence. 155 acres of isolation, and from the outside, it looked like any other rundown property struggling through the 1950s. But inside those walls, something twisted was growing, and on November 16th, 1957, the world would finally see what happens when a human mind breaks completely. Plainfield was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, where the population barely scraped past 700 people, and where nothing exciting ever really happened, until it did. The hardware store stood quiet that Saturday morning, and Bernice Worden, 58 years old, opened the doors like she had countless times before. The first day of deer hunting season meant most of the town's men were already deep in the woods, and the store would be slow. Around 9:30 that morning, a familiar face walked through the door. Ed Gein was known around town as the quiet handyman, who did odd jobs, a man who kept to himself but always seemed harmless. Awkward, sure, but harmless. He'd been in the store just the day before, asking about antifreeze for his truck, and Bernice told him she'd have it ready the next morning. What happened next shattered that small community forever. Ed returned for the antifreeze, but he also brought a .22 caliber rifle. When Bernice turned her back, he shot her. Then he loaded her dead body into his vehicle and drove it back to his farmhouse, where he hung her in the shed and butchered her like a deer. When Bernice's son Frank returned from hunting that evening around 5 o'clock, he found the store empty. The cash register sat open, and a trail of blood led from behind the counter toward the back door. Frank Worden wasn't just Bernice's son, though. He was also a deputy sheriff, and every instinct told him something terrible had happened. But when he checked the receipt book, he found the last sale recorded: 1 gallon of antifreeze, sold to Ed Gein. The police moved fast, and within hours they'd located Gein at a grocery store, walking about like he had done nothing wrong. They arrested him on the spot, while another team of officers headed out to his isolated farmhouse to search for Bernice Worden. What they were about to discover would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The officers approached the darkened farmhouse with flashlights cutting through the November cold. The main house had no electricity, so they made their way around to a shed in the back, fumbling through the darkness until one of them swept his beam across the rafters. What he saw made him stumble backward and vomit. Hanging upside down from a crossbar, suspended by ropes around her ankles, was a human body. It had been gutted like a deer, opened from sternum to pelvis, completely hollowed out. The head was missing. This was Bernice Worden, and she'd been turned into something no human being should ever have to witness. But this was just the beginning. As more officers arrived and began searching the main farmhouse, they realized they'd stepped into a nightmare that defied comprehension. The house was a disaster, filled with piles of trash and junk, reeking of decay and rot. But scattered among the filth were objects that didn't belong, objects that would make even hardened investigators question everything they thought they knew about the dark sides of human nature. They found Bernice Worden's head inside a burlap sack, with nails driven through both ears and bent into hooks so it could be hung like a decoration. Her heart sat in a plastic bag in front of the stove, But the horror didn't stop there, because as the officers kept searching, they discovered that Bernice wasn't Ed Gein's only victim. In a paper bag, they found a face. Not a head, just the face itself, carefully peeled away and preserved. It belonged to Mary Hogan, a 51-year-old tavern owner who'd vanished nearly 3 years earlier, on December 8, 1954. Her skull was found in a box nearby, and then they started finding the furniture. 4 chairs had been upholstered with human skin. A wastebasket was made from flesh. There were lampshades crafted from faces, leggings fashioned from leg skin, and a corset made from an entire female torso, breasts still attached. Human skulls had been sawed in half and turned into bowls. Others were mounted on the bedposts like decorations. They found masks made from women's faces, preserved and treated with motor oil to keep the skin supple, some with lipstick still applied to the lips. There was a belt made entirely from human nipples, a window shade crafted from a pair of lips, a shoebox containing 9 vulvas, 4 noses stored together, female fingernails collected in a jar. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery was what investigators called the mammary vest, an entire suit made from the skin of a woman's torso and legs, complete and wearable. Ed Gein had been crafting a woman's suit, something he could put on and become someone else entirely. The town of Plainfield erupted into chaos and disbelief. This was Ed Gein, the shy handyman who babysat children, who did odd jobs around town, who seemed like nothing more than a lonely, awkward man. How could this be the same person? But to understand what created the monster living in that farmhouse, you have to go back to the beginning, back to August 27, 1906, when Edward Theodore Gein was born in La Crosse County, Wisconsin. From his very first breath, Ed's life was shaped by 2 people who would twist him into something unrecognizable: his parents, George and Augusta Gein. George Gein was a broken man and a violent alcoholic. He worked when he could, doing jobs as a carpenter, tanner, and firefighter, but the bottle always called louder than his responsibilities. When he drank, which was often, he became violent, beating his sons. The abuse was so severe that Ed's ears would ring from being struck on the head. But George, who died of heart failure at age 66 on April 1, 1940, wasn't the real problem. That honor belonged to his wife, Augusta. Augusta Wilhelmina Gein was a force of nature, a woman consumed by religious fanaticism who saw sin in everything and everyone. She was fervently Lutheran, but not in any gentle, forgiving way. Her God was the Old Testament God of wrath and judgment, and she made sure her sons knew it. Every single afternoon, Augusta would gather her boys and read to them from the Bible. But she didn't read them stories of compassion or redemption. She read passages about death, murder, and divine retribution. She taught them that the world was evil, that all women except her were whores and instruments of the devil, that sex was the greatest sin, and that they must remain virgins forever or face eternal damnation. Augusta had 2 sons, Henry, born in 1902, and Ed, born 4 years later. But she'd wanted a daughter, and when God gave her boys instead, she convinced herself they were punishment for some unnamed sin. So she decided to mold them into something pure, something untouched by the corrupt world outside. When Ed was around 8 years old, Augusta made a decision that would seal her son's fates. She decided La Crosse was too sinful, too corrupt, filled with temptation and immorality. So she sold the family grocery store, packed up their lives, and moved the family to an isolated farmhouse on 155 acres outside Plainfield. The nearest neighbor was a mile away. Ed and Henry were rarely allowed to leave the farm except to attend school, and even then, Augusta punished Ed whenever he tried to make friends. She told him other children would corrupt him, that the world outside was evil, and that he should trust no one but her. The boys grew up in complete isolation, cut off from normal social development, trapped in a house filled with violence and religious terror. If you are still watching, click the like button, subscribe, and drop a comment. I would like to know what you would have done if you had seen what was going on early enough in that isolated farmhouse. At school, Ed was quiet, awkward, different. He had a growth on his left eyelid that gave him a lazy eye, and a lesion on his tongue that caused a speech impediment. Kids are cruel to those who stand out, and Ed was bullied mercilessly. Sometimes he'd come home crying, only to have his father beat him for showing weakness. There was no comfort, no safety, nowhere to turn. The only escape Ed found was in reading. He was an excellent reader, and he'd lose himself in books, disappearing into worlds that weren't filled with pain and fear. But even this would later twist into something dark. When Ed was around 12 years old, Augusta caught him masturbating in the bathtub. She was horrified. She grabbed his genitals and called them the curse of man, and she scalded him with hot water to punish him for his sin. For a boy already taught that his body was evil and that sex was the ultimate corruption, this was just another confirmation that he was fundamentally wrong. Years passed in this toxic, isolated nightmare. Ed dropped out of school around 8th grade to work full-time on the farm. He had no friends, no life outside the farmhouse walls, no identity apart from what his mother created for him. And through it all, despite the abuse and control and constant humiliation, Ed worshipped Augusta. He saw her as a saint, as the only person who truly understood the evil of the world, as his protector and savior. When she criticized him, he believed he deserved it. When she told him he was nothing without her, he believed that too. His older brother Henry started seeing things differently. As Henry got older, he began questioning their mother's grip on their lives. He started criticizing Augusta when she wasn't around, telling Ed that their relationship wasn't normal, that her control over him was sick and unhealthy. He even started dating a divorced mother of two, planning to move in with her and build a life away from the farm. This infuriated Augusta, who saw the woman as a sinner and Henry as a traitor. But it also did something to Ed. It made him angry at his brother for attacking the woman he idolized. Then, on May 16, 1944, Henry died. The official story was that the brothers were burning brush on the farm when the fire got out of control. They got separated, and when Ed couldn't find Henry, he went for help. But here's what made it suspicious. When the search party arrived, Ed led them directly to Henry's body. Not to where they'd been separated, not to where he'd last seen him. Straight to the exact spot where Henry lay face down in the marsh, untouched by the fire, but with bruises on his head. The medical examiner ruled it death by asphyxiation from smoke inhalation, even though Henry's body showed no signs of burns, and the bruises on his head suggested violence. No autopsy was performed, and no further investigation was conducted. The authorities took Ed at his word, because who would suspect quiet, awkward Ed Gein of murder? Looking back, many believe Henry was Ed's first victim, killed because he threatened to expose the truth about Augusta and break the bond between mother and son. With Henry gone, it was just Ed and Augusta on the farm, which was exactly what Ed wanted. He finally had his mother all to himself, but their time together didn't last long. Shortly after Henry's death, Augusta suffered a stroke that left her partially paralyzed. Ed became her devoted caregiver, tending to her every need, hoping finally to earn the love and approval he'd always craved. He'd get into bed with her to comfort her, stroking her hair, caring for her like she was the most precious thing in the world. Augusta didn't show him gratitude. She never did. Even bedridden and dependent on him, she continued to criticize, to control, and remind him that he was nothing without her. Then, sometime in 1945, Augusta and Ed visited a neighbor named Smith to buy straw. While they were there, Smith started beating his dog violently. A woman who lived with Smith, who was his girlfriend, ran out and begged him to stop. Augusta was horrified, not because a dog was being killed in front of them, but because Smith was living in sin with this woman. She called the woman Smith's harlot and flew into a rage. The stress triggered a second stroke, and this time it was fatal. On December 29, 1945, Augusta Gein died at age 67. Ed was 39 years old, and in that moment, his entire world shattered. At Augusta's funeral, Ed wailed like a child, sobbing uncontrollably, unable to accept that she was gone. She had been his only friend, his one true love, the center of his entire existence. Without her, he had no identity, no purpose, and no reason to be alive. In the days and weeks after her death, Ed began to deteriorate. He boarded up the rooms Augusta had used most, her bedroom, the upstairs, the downstairs parlor, sealing them off as shrines to her memory. He wanted them to stay exactly as she'd left them, frozen in time, perfect and untouched. The rest of the house fell into complete squalor. Trash piled up, junk accumulated. Everything became filthy and rotting. Ed himself stopped bathing, stopped caring about his appearance, and people around town started noticing how badly he smelled. But the changes went far deeper than hygiene. Something fundamental had broken in Ed's mind, and in the isolation of that farmhouse, with no one to check his behavior or question his thoughts, he began sliding into psychosis. He started reading obsessively, books about anatomy, medical textbooks, Nazi medical experiments, stories about cannibalism and mutilation. He became particularly fascinated by Ilse Koch, the Nazi who made lampshades from the tattooed skin of concentration camp prisoners. He also read pornography and horror magazines, filling his mind with violence and death. And he started thinking about his mother, about how much he missed her, about how he wanted her back, about how, if he couldn't have her, maybe he could become her. Around 1947, 2 years after Augusta's death, Ed began making nocturnal trips to local cemeteries. He'd study the obituaries, looking for middle-aged women who'd recently died and been buried, women who reminded him of his mother. Then he'd wait until nightfall, drive to the cemetery, and dig them up. He claimed he did this in a daze-like state, that sometimes he'd snap out of it and go home empty-handed. But other times, he'd complete the task, dragging the corpses back to his farmhouse, where he'd use the skills his father had taught him about tanning hides to preserve the skin and bones. Between 1947 and 1952, Ed made approximately 40 trips to different cemeteries in the town. He admitted to successfully exhuming 9 corpses, though the actual number was likely higher. He'd take the entire body, or just parts, whatever he needed for his projects. Because Ed Gein was building something. He was creating a woman suit, a complete outfit made from human skin that he could wear to become his mother. He fashioned leggings from leg skin, a torso vest from the chest, and breasts of a female corpse, masks from faces carefully peeled away and preserved. He'd put on these garments and dance around the farmhouse by moonlight, pretending to be Augusta, trying to bring her back from the dead. But the corpses he dug up weren't quite right. They were decomposing, rotting, not fresh enough for what he really wanted. And that's when Ed Gein crossed a line even darker than grave robbing. That's when he decided to start killing. On the afternoon of December 8, 1954, Ed walked into Mary Hogan's tavern in Pine Grove. Mary was 51 years old, a divorcee who ran the tavern alone, and she reminded Ed of his mother. She was stocky and short, with a commanding presence, though her foul mouth and rough personality were nothing like Augusta's religious fervor. Ed had been to the tavern several times before, always watching Mary, always thinking about her. That December afternoon, he waited until all the other customers had left. When Mary told him she was closing, Ed said nothing. He walked behind the bar, pulled out a gun, and shot her in the head. Mary died instantly. Ed dragged her body out to a sled he'd positioned outside and spent the next several minutes hauling her corpse back to his farm. He preserved her face as a mask and kept her skull in a box. The rest of her body he cut up and burned, keeping only what he needed for his collection. For 3 years, Mary Hogan's disappearance remained a mystery. The police found blood and a bullet casing at the tavern, but with no body and no suspects, the case went cold. Ed even joked about it to neighbors, saying, "She's not missing, she's at my house." But everyone laughed it off as his odd sense of humor. No one suspected the quiet handyman. But Ed wasn't done. The murder had given him something the grave robbing couldn't: fresh, uncorrupted flesh. And 3 years later, he'd do it again. November 16, 1957, he murdered Bernice Worden. But this time, Ed made a careless mistake. He left a receipt with his name on it. When the police arrested Ed Gein that evening, he was calm, almost cooperative. For the first 13 hours of questioning, he refused to speak. But after investigators confronted him with what they'd found at his farmhouse, something shifted. Ed asked for a slice of apple pie with cheese on top. The officers got it for him. And then Ed Gein started talking. He confessed to killing both Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden. He admitted to the grave robbing, describing how he'd exhume bodies under the cover of darkness, how he'd only take corpses of women who resembled his mother, how he'd tan the skin and craft his macabre furniture and clothing. He explained that he never had sex with the corpses because they smelled too bad, and that he was still a virgin, still keeping the promise he'd made to his mother. When police asked why he'd done these things, Ed struggled to explain. He said he wanted to create a woman suit so he could become his mother. He said he'd been in a daze during the grave robbings, that voices guided him. He denied being a cannibal, denied being sexually motivated, denied remembering much about the actual murders. What became clear was that Ed Gein existed in a fractured reality where his mother was still alive somehow, where the corpses he collected were just materials for a project, where none of this felt wrong because he was simply trying to bring back the only person who'd ever mattered to him. The police also wanted to know if Ed had killed others. Several people had vanished from the Plainfield area over the years. 8-year-old Georgia Jean Weckler disappeared in 1947 while walking home from school. 15-year-old Evelyn Hartley vanished in 1953 while babysitting. 2 hunters, Victor Travis and Raymond Burgess, disappeared in 1952 after visiting a bar in Plainfield. Ed's neighbor, James Walsh, went missing in 1954. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and let me know if you think Ed Gein killed more than 2 people based on how many dead bodies were discovered in his residence. Ed denied involvement in all of these cases. He passed lie detector tests, though the reliability of such tests, especially with someone potentially suffering from schizophrenia, is questionable. Psychiatrists who examined him concluded that his violence was directed only at middle-aged women who reminded him of his mother. Without bodies or concrete evidence, these cases remain unsolved. What police could confirm was the grave robbing. They exhumed several graves Ed had mentioned and found them exactly as he'd described. One casket was completely empty. Another was empty except for Ed's crowbar, which he'd accidentally left behind. A third contained only partial remains, with jewelry and some bones still present. The corpses had been taken, just as Ed claimed. On November 21, 1957, Ed Gein was arraigned on 1 count of first-degree murder for killing Bernice Worden. He pled not guilty by reason of insanity. Doctors diagnosed him with schizophrenia and found him mentally incompetent to stand trial. He was sent to the Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane in Waupun, Wisconsin. While Ed was locked away, the town of Plainfield tried to process what had happened. The media descended in droves, turning the quiet community into a circus. Reporters came from around the world to cover the story of the Butcher of Plainfield, the Plainfield Ghoul, the man who made furniture from human skin. But something strange happened in the aftermath. People started making jokes. Gein humor became a thing. dark jokes about Ed's crimes that spread across the country. What do you find in Ed Gein's shower? Heads and shoulders. What did Ed Gein say to the waitress? Keep the tip. The jokes were a way to process the horror, to make something incomprehensible feel manageable through dark humor. Ed's house and property were appraised at $4,700, and his possessions were scheduled to be auctioned on March 30th, 1958. But early on the morning of March 20th, 10 days before the auction, the farmhouse burned to the ground. A deputy fire marshal reported that a cleaning crew had set a garbage fire 75 feet from the house while disposing of refuse. Hot coals were recovered from that spot, but investigators noted the fire hadn't spread along the ground from there to the house. Arson was strongly suspected. The community didn't want Ed's property turned into a tourist attraction, but the cause was never officially determined. It's worth noting that the fire chief at the time was Frank Worden, the son of Ed's victim, Bernice Worden. When Ed heard about the fire while in detention, he simply shrugged and said, "Just as well." His possessions were still auctioned off, and people bought them eagerly. His car, the one he'd used to transport bodies, sold for $760 to a carnival operator named Bunny Gibbons, who turned it into a sideshow attraction. For 25 cents, people could see the death car and take a photo with it. Over 2,000 people showed up for the first viewing. For 10 years, Ed Gein remained in the mental hospital, and during that time, he was described as a model patient. He was quiet, helpful, cooperative, and never caused problems. Some staff members even grew fond of him, but others noted that during full moons, something changed. Ed would become agitated and start talking about women, about what he'd done to their bodies, about his macabre crafts. Then the moon would wane, and he'd return to his mild-mannered self. In 1968, doctors finally determined that Ed was competent enough to stand trial. The trial began on November 7th and lasted just 1 week. Ed's defense team argued that while he'd committed the murder, he'd been insane at the time, completely disconnected from reality. A psychiatrist testified that Ed claimed the gun had simply gone off while he was examining it in Bernice's store, that he didn't remember aiming it or pulling the trigger, that everything after that was a blur. On November 14, 1968, Judge Robert Golmar found Ed Gein guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Bernice Worden. But then, in a second phase of the trial, the judge ruled Ed not guilty by reason of insanity and ordered him committed back to Central State Hospital for the rest of his life. Ed would never face trial for Mary Hogan's murder. The prosecutors decided it wasn't worth the cost, since Ed was already locked away forever. Her family never got full legal closure, though Ed's confession was part of the public record. Ed Gein spent the remaining years of his life institutionalized. In the late 1970s, with his health failing from lung cancer, he was transferred to Mendota Mental Health Institute in Madison. Ed died at that same mental health institute on July 26, 1984, at age 77, from respiratory failure related to lung cancer. He was buried in Plainfield Cemetery, right between his mother Augusta and his brother Henry, in the same graveyard where he'd once dug up corpses in the dead of night. Over the years, souvenir seekers chipped away pieces of his gravestone, treating it like a macabre collectible. Finally, in the year 2000, someone stole the entire gravestone. It was recovered in June 2001 near Seattle, Washington, and placed in storage at the Waushara County Sheriff's Department. Since then, Ed Gein's grave has remained deliberately unmarked to prevent it from becoming a tourist destination. But Ed Gein's legacy didn't end with his death. In fact, his story had already begun influencing American culture years before he died. In 1959, a writer named Robert Bloch was living in Wisconsin and reading about the Gein case in the newspapers. He was fascinated by the psychological aspects, the domineering mother, the isolation, and the twisted devotion that led to the murders. Bloch used these elements to write a novel called Psycho, about a man named Norman Bates who runs a motel keeps his dead mother's body in the house, and kills women who remind him of her. In 1960, Alfred Hitchcock turned Psycho into one of the most influential horror films ever made. Norman Bates became iconic, and his line, "A boy's best friend is his mother," took on chilling new meaning for anyone who knew the story of Ed Gein. But that was just the beginning. In 1974, director Tobe Hooper created the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, inspired partially by Ed Gein's crimes. The character Leatherface, who wears a mask made of human skin and decorates his house with body parts, was directly influenced by what police found in Ed's farmhouse. Then, in 1991, The Silence of the Lambs introduced Buffalo Bill, a killer who skinned his victims to create a woman suit he could wear, just like Ed Gein had done. The film won multiple Academy Awards and cemented Ed's influence on the horror genre. Ed Gein also inspired Deranged in 1974, House of 1,000 Corpses in 2003, The Devil's Rejects in 2005, and the character of Dr. Oliver Thredson in American Horror Story Asylum in 2012. In 2025, Netflix released Monster, the Ed Gein story, as the third season of Ryan Murphy's true crime anthology series, with Charlie Hunnam portraying Ed. The series debuted on October 3, 2025, bringing Gein's story to a new generation and reigniting public fascination with the case nearly 70 years after his crimes were discovered. Musicians have also been drawn to Ed's story. The band Slayer wrote Dead Skin Mask for their 1990 album Seasons in the Abyss. Blind Melon's Skinned was directly about Ed. Mudvayne named a song Nothing to Gain. The band Tad wrote Nipple Belt. Ed Gein's crimes became part of American folklore, a touchstone for horror and true crime that continues to fascinate decades later. But why? What is it about Ed Gein that captures our imagination in ways other killers don't? Part of it is the sheer grotesquerie of what he did. The furniture made from human skin, the masks, the bodysuit, these things are beyond most people's comprehension. They're so extreme that they feel almost fictional, like something from a nightmare rather than real life. But there's something deeper, too. Ed Gein represents a specific kind of American horror, the monster hiding in plain sight, or the quiet neighbor who turns out to be capable of unimaginable evil. He wasn't a charismatic Ted Bundy or an obviously disturbed Richard Chase. He was awkward and shy, someone people felt sorry for, someone who babysat their children. The idea that someone so seemingly harmless could be doing such horrific things challenges our ability to trust our own judgment about people. Ed also embodies questions about nature versus nurture that we're still grappling with today. Was he born with something broken in his brain? Or did Augusta's abuse and isolation create the monster he became? The psychiatrists who examined him said he suffered from schizophrenia, that he experienced hallucinations and heard voices. But they also acknowledged that his childhood was profoundly traumatic, that the isolation and religious fanaticism and physical abuse would have damaged anyone. Most serial killers don't have warm childhoods, but Ed's was extreme even by those standards. He was raised in complete isolation by a mother who taught him that he was sinful, that his body was evil, that women were instruments of the devil, and that he was nothing without her. He was beaten by his father, bullied at school, humiliated at home, and given no tools to develop a normal sense of self. When Augusta died, Ed didn't just lose his mother, he lost his entire identity. Everything he was had been defined by her. Without her, he literally didn't know who he was or how to exist in the world. So he tried to bring her back, first by preserving her rooms as shrines, then by digging up corpses that reminded him of her, and finally by creating a suit he could wear to become her. It's also significant that Ed was never sexually motivated. He never had sex with the corpses, never engaged in necrophilia, remained a virgin his entire life. His crimes weren't about sexual gratification. They were about loss and identity, and a desperate, psychotic attempt to resurrect the only person who'd ever mattered to him. The two women he murdered, Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden, both physically resembled Augusta. In killing them, Ed was both trying to possess his mother and punishing her for leaving him. It was love and hate twisted into something sinister. Today, more than 67 years after Ed Gein's arrest, his name still resonates. The farmhouse is long gone, burned to ashes. His grave remains hidden and unmarked, but the story remains, told and retold in documentaries, films, books, and podcasts. Plainfield, Wisconsin, has tried to move past its association with Ed Gein. The town has produced doctors, architects, teachers, and good people who have nothing to do with one crazy man's crimes. But the notoriety persists, and even now, people make pilgrimages to the area, looking for remnants of Ed's story. In 1995, during excavation on the old Gein property, workers discovered remains of 10 females and 1 male in an old well, suggesting Ed's victim count may have been far higher than the 2 he confessed to, but without definitive identification or evidence linking these remains to Ed, they remain one more mystery in a case full of unanswered questions. During questioning, Sheriff Art Schley reportedly assaulted Ed by banging his head and face into a brick wall. As a result, Ed's initial confession was ruled inadmissible in court, a technicality that could have derailed the entire prosecution if Ed hadn't confessed again later. Schley died of heart failure in 1968 at age 43, just before Ed's trial began. Many who knew Schley said he was deeply traumatized by what he'd seen in Ed's house that November night. The images haunted him, and some believed that fear of having to testify, particularly about his own assault on Gein, contributed to the stress that killed him. The community struggled with its own trauma for years. Children had nightmares. Adults couldn't look at their neighbor's house the same way. Trust was shattered. People who'd known Ed, who'd hired him for work, who'd had him babysit their kids, had to reconcile the mild-mannered handyman with the monster living in that farmhouse. Some people developed what became known as Gein humor as a coping mechanism, creating dark jokes about the case that helped them process the horror. Others couldn't speak about it at all, wanting desperately to forget. A few moved away, unable to live in a town that would forever be associated with such horror. And through it all, one question has persisted. Could this have been prevented? If someone had investigated Henry's death more thoroughly, would they have uncovered Ed's capacity for violence? If the community hadn't dismissed Ed as harmless but odd, would someone have noticed warning signs? If Augusta had been reported for child abuse, if George had gotten help for his alcoholism, if Ed had received psychiatric treatment after his mother's death, could any of these interventions have stopped what happened? We'll never know. What we do know is that Ed Gein represents an intersection of mental illness, severe childhood trauma, isolation, and a complete failure of community oversight that resulted in some of the most horrific crimes in American history. If you watched up to this point, please like, subscribe, and let me know if you think psychiatric help after Augusta's death could have prevented these murders, or if you think some people are naturally born to do evil. Ed Gein killed only 2 people, far fewer than many serial killers, but his impact on American culture, on our understanding of criminal psychology, and on the horror genre has been profound and lasting. He showed us that monsters don't always look like monsters, that evil can wear the mask of awkwardness and vulnerability, and that the line between human and inhuman is far thinner than we'd like to believe. In the end, Ed Gein was a profoundly broken man who never should have existed in the form he took. He was created by abuse, shaped by isolation, and destroyed by the loss of the only person who'd ever defined him. What he did was unforgivable and horrifying. But understanding how he came to be might help us recognize warning signs in others. It might also help us see when isolation and trauma are creating conditions for darkness to grow. The farmhouse is gone. Ed Gein is gone. Augusta is gone. But the questions remain, and the warning persists. Evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it grows quietly in the dark, in isolation, in houses where no one is watching and no one is asking if everything is okay. And sometimes, by the time anyone notices, it's far too late.
I want to thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you're going to love what's coming next. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell for instant updates on our latest videos. See you in the next one.